Another question from the audience.
I'd like to ask about Islam from the standpoint of its own historical context, rather than from the prism of our absolute individual standards, or mixing the Muslim apple with the Christian orange, if you will, which doesn't take us very far. If we begin, say, 950 years ago, when Islam was arguably the intellectual capital of the world. Since then, there's clearly been a trend of insularity and anti-intellectualism in the past 1,000 years. Assuming that is true, what has been the trend in terms of tolerance and radicalism, and in particular, not just the last 1,000 years, but the last 100 and last 50 years?
Dick Bulliet.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about that. You made a statement, then you said, assuming that to be true. Well, that's a big assumption. You're talking about 950 years ago. You're talking about, roughly the year 1100, right? Okay. It is a commonplace of the history of Western culture that Europe was behind at one point, and then at a certain point, Islam stagnated and became backward, whereas Europe leapt ahead and created the modern world. In large part based on borrowings in one way or another from Islam. But the notion that Islam stagnated is contrary to historical fact in certain ways. In particular, over half of all the people in the world today who are Muslims are the descendants of people who converted to Islam after this alleged period of stagnation. Islam's greatest success in terms of the growth of the faith community was in the period when Europeans are claiming that Islam was stagnant. What happened in that period was that you had an enormous and very complex interaction of Islam with communities in all parts of the world, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, Europe, Eastern Europe, and so forth. And Islam became immensely richer and more complex through this interaction. Now, some people say, well, Europe was open to all sorts of new ideas, but in fact, Europe was open to its own new ideas. There's not a single major idea in European history that actually came from anywhere except Europe, because Europe has been kind of a closed, or Euro-American society, been fairly closed to the conceptual life, the spiritual life, so forth, of other parts of the world. Islam was remarkably open. And so I think it's a question of, if you say that that all that counts is who gets rich and who wins wars and who's able to set up an imperialist system, then you have one argument. But if you're talking about the notion of stagnation, Islam certainly did not stagnate in that period. This was a period of enormous growth and development of complexity and intercommunal cross-fertilization.
Mm-hmm. We have time for another question from the audience.
According to a 2007 Pew study, over 60% of Muslims in America identified as moderate, and I was hoping
excuse me?
Moderates. So I was hoping that Asra can elaborate a little bit on it. Why is Islam dominated by radicals?
Asra Nomani.
Like I've said before, this is not a conversation about the majority of Muslims. We're talking about whether Islam is dominated. Dominated to me means institutional Islam. It means the people who are running our mosques, the people who are running our organizations. It means this establishment that I call Wahhabism Incorporated, that is basically not just, a pocket, an empty anecdote. It is an empire out there in the world that is defining our community. This isn't a popularity contest about whether we want moderate expression of Islam or not. This is about who's running our communities. And I can tell you that institutional Islam is representing a radical ideology that may not represent what most of Muslims believe, but at the end of the day, it's not worth the trouble for most Muslims to battle them. I can tell you from the trenches, the struggle to battle that kind of institutional Islam is painful. You lose status, you get death threats, you get all sorts of abuse. And this is what happens whenever you challenge the authorities. And right now, the authorities represent radical Islam.